As Chief of Navy, I do see this as a great opportunity. Having been in the position for about 9 months now, having inherited some big decisions, I have a pressing need to express my views on some of the key aspects of Navy's future requirements, and this conference provides me the opportunity to do so. But I'd like to clarify a few points right up front. I will not be using this as an opportunity to define in front of you the top-level requirement for C5000, nor will I be making or preempting an announcement on the frigate decision. But I am counting on the fact that what I say today will have some influence on the outcome. I would also say I had expected the previous speakers to have set somewhat the strategic context in which some of these things will have been done. They have done that, they have delivered, and so I will not dwell on those particular aspects during my presentation. But during the course of this conference, you will hear from many who are well-qualified speakers and who will dwell on their precise aspects of their particular organisations, their projects and their roles in the delivery of capability. My aim, therefore, is to stick to the broader considerations of why and how, and not necessarily the how many or where. As we'd say in USN parlance, I'm the requirements guy. This should not be a surprise for many of you who understand the contemporary role of the Service Chief in the Australian Defence Force, but I will seek to reinforce the understanding of my role for all of you during the course of this presentation. So I intend to discuss 3 significant issues that are vitally important to me in the surface combatant debate: lethality, effects, and ship availability. I'll say that again: lethality, effects, and ship availability. I have no doubt that there will be other principles or concerns that will be raised over the next 2 days, but these 3 reflect my current thoughts and I think are worthy of discussion in a forum like this. As I alluded to, I won't be discussing in detail platform numbers or industry policy per se, and again there are others who will do that. But I will pass some quick thoughts on the industry to add further to the debate before I conclude. And I think this is important because, as President Kennedy once said, too often we enjoy the comfort of opinion without the discomfort of thought. My task is to add to the debate and possibly promote some contestability, which is the catchphrase of today. So let me start by making some observations that during my watch as Chief of Navy, not only will we see the acceptance into service of 2 LHDs, the Seahawk Romeo helicopters and the first of the air warfare destroyers, but we will also be required to finalise the plans for the concurrent replacement of a significant number of other major naval capabilities, all due in the coming decade. The confluence and the timing of these program schedules has complicated the job of our national decision makers, as they are faced with an increasing complexity and magnitude of the decisions that need to be made and the inherent inertia that naturally flows from making such large commitments. But they are decisions that need to be made, and if made decisively and deliberately, they will present opportunity for Navy and also for industry by providing greater clarity and certainty. At this point, though, I would like to say that we should not be surprised by the magnitude of these decisions. Every major naval shipbuilding program has and will continue to consume a significant proportion of the defence spending. And whilst it's large, I do not believe it is disproportionate, given the effects that are achieved by these capabilities. So my job as the Chief of Navy is to ensure that everyone who impacts on the critical decisions that will generate the future fleet grasps the strategic purpose, the operational concepts, and the capability requirements around which the future fleet is designed and funded, thereby ensuring expenditure is proportionate to the need. But I state we're not simply buying the weapon. Each ship in itself is a small township. It generates its own power, waste and sewerage. It sustains hundreds of people for months on end. It will stay in theatre for extended periods and be capable of delivering its ordnance at any time during that period. Given Australia's unique strategic position, you cannot simply buy naval capability of consequence off a rolling production line that you might say a C-17. And here I'm not advocating that we need to talk about changes. I'm just saying Aircraft production lines make it easier to do this. But I would also say that with this confluence, and with the sheer size and aggregate spend that now has to be considered, the debate over significant shipbuilding programs has sometimes overshadowed the strategic capability debate that still needs to be had. So let me quickly reiterate some of those points. Australia is an engaged global player. We are a successful trading nation. We are a beneficiary of and a contributor to the system of global trade, finance and communication. This reflects the fact that we are a nation with valuable sovereign territory, including some of the largest maritime areas of the world. As part of the ADF, the Australian Navy contributes to enforce our sovereignty, defends our interests and maintains the international systems on which, along with our friends and allies, our way of life depends. A sophisticated nation with global interest needs a capable Navy with global reach and global influence. These statements reflect current government strategic guidance. But the environment in which we operate is changing. Many nations in our region are increasing their maritime focus, either with changing patterns of trade, the emergence of prominent offshore resource claims, or even sovereignty claims. This is a maritime century, and there is a clear focus on the Indo-Pacific region. Our response to promote Australia's interest in this maritime domain needs a balance of ADF force structure with joint operational capability. We are a middle power. As such, our influence and force size do not allow us to meet all contingencies alone. No one element of the force can be configured to retain a purely sovereign capability at the expense of all else. Balanced force design is critical, and I note that Lieutenant General Caligari will discuss this later in the conference. But as part of that response, the major surface combatants of the fleet provide the government with options, significant options, to represent Australia's national resolve and meet the full spectrum of threats that may challenge us within the maritime environment. And with that brief strategic thought in mind, I'd like to tackle the first of the three issues that I think underpins Navy's requirements, that of lethality. This is a consideration for all surface fleets, however large or small. Let me start by saying that in 1982 I spent a year on exchange with the Royal Navy. It was an extraordinary year to be there, as it's a time where their government took them to the war in the Falklands. I do recall the intense debate over the deployment of warships into harm's way during that conflict. What stuck in my mind was a ship's commanding officer who resolutely said, "We build warships to go to war. Why else would we build them?" Perhaps it was a different time and perhaps it was a distant event, but there are some principles here that underpin naval requirements right from the start. That is, we need to rigorously discuss warfare. Some would argue that it has become unfashionable to talk about prosecuting war rather than building peace. Like all citizens, I do see a thriving economy, a confident diplomacy, and a cohesive society as the best guarantors of long-term stability and security. But the fact remains, the ADF provides government, when required, the ability to continue policy by other means, as Clausewitz would have it. Together with my fellow service chief and my departmental colleagues, it is my task to address the what-if question. What if an aggressor seeks to constrain Australia's freedom? Freedom to trade, freedom to move. We need to ensure that the Chief of the Defence Force has at his or her, in the future, ability to command the capabilities necessary to deliver a range of escalating measures, including decisive lethality, should the government so direct. There is a consistency between my views and those of other naval forces, and I'd like to quote a recent comment made by Vice Admiral Rowden, USN, who is currently serving as the Naval Surface Forces in the US Pacific Fleet. He says, "Going on the offensive is a mindset, a way of thinking about naval warfare. It means thinking a good bit more about how to destroy that than how to defend this. We still need to be able to defend high-value units, amphibious forces, convoys and logistics, but we will increasingly defend them by reaching out and destroying threats before those threats are able to target what we are defending. This is an important facet in the requirements debate. Lethality brings consequences to all aspects of our fleet's acquisition. For instance, in the platform domain, it constantly challenges the tension between, say, a commercial build and a full military build. That is, affordability versus survivability, and with the attendant discussion on its utility during damage control situations. Likewise, in the combat system domain, we need to understand where new technology is taking us and how it will shape our fleet design and future lethality. For example, what impact will network sensors have on our lethality and tactical reach? And how should we prioritise offensive versus defensive weapons? All good questions to be asked. Each of these issues ultimately leads to a decision as to how you can employ the ship, if at all, during escalating conflict. For me, this is topical at the moment as I watch the very good process that is being made as we introduce the LHD into service, and the reverie behind the discussion that the ship was acquired principally for humanitarian assistance and disaster relief. This was not the government's intent when the decision was made to acquire these ships. It will be those ships' ability to posture for operational manoeuvre and deliver a comprehensive and lethal land force ashore that will confirm their utility. Once that is proven and practiced, HADR will be an alternative mission outcome of great strategic importance. Bottom line, lethality remains a key determinant in the requirements phase. The second issue I want to raise is that of understanding the effects sought early during a requirement stage. There is a tendency by all quarters, government, defence and industry, to leap onto the numbers of ships or submarines needed before full consideration of the effect we are trying to deliver. It's an input mentality rather than an outcome focus. And given the early discussion about shipbuilding program costs, it is sometimes understandable. But what is often not understood is the value in representing the requirement in terms of effect and risk, which prompts discussion of alternate solutions. In essence, it's about capability, it's not about the platform. As I have said, one of the core responsibilities of the service chiefs is to ensure that the conceptual foundations and structural principles on which their service operate are well understood by decision makers and operators alike during the force design process. But it is then essential to translate these concepts into effects to be achieved rather than a prescribed solution which may focus solely on the platform. And let me use an example. It has been raised somewhat by previous speakers. The concept of theatre anti-submarine warfare, theatre ASW, is gaining currency in the ADF. It reflects the fact that by about 2030, as we've heard, about half the world's submarines will be operating in our near region. In its simplest form, theatre ASW is about gaining sufficient undersea domain awareness through cooperation across navies using all available means to be able to locate all submarines with sufficient fidelity to allow you to act where you need and when you need to maintain the initiative. In referring to all available means, I contend that this means everything from all source intelligence, even alliance management, space-based assets, P8s, towed arrays such as the one that is likely to be carried by a C-5000 frigate, and I said I wasn't going to go into the TLR, but please bear with me, seabed arrays, and, but not exclusively, the number of submarines in your submarine force. Therefore, within an effects-based regime, a meaningful contribution to theatre ASW across a range of capabilities and even diplomatic engagements could lead to a disproportionate outcome in our favour. A meaningful contribution. It will allow us to resolve our sovereign needs by placing our ASW capabilities in the right place at the right time. A second example relates to the surface combatant force itself and how that force is currently viewed. Most see the surface fleet as individual platforms configured to act alone and therefore weaponed up to do so. This is not an unsurprising notion because for the last at least 2 decades, the Navy has largely operated in single units on many operations, with task group formations being the exception. Future strategic planning will see the fleet revert to task group operations as the norm. And while the increasing capability threat has been a principal driver for this change, to offer appropriate protection for critical mission elements such as the LHD, a whole range of future likely scenarios based on effects planning will see surface combatants operating as task groups more often than not. The task group the task group methodology, and I guess a mentality, offers strategic utility to government by delivering the agility and responsiveness that is the heart of 21st century approach to maritime warfare. Repackaging the capability this way enables more effects to be achieved against an ever-growing threat or set of threat scenarios. But it achieves all ships within the task group to be network-enabled across the whole ADF. It requires ships to collaborate on their offensive capability, sharing fire control data and controlling weapons across the task group using cooperative sensor netting and over-the-horizon engagement. But it also requires each ship to provide collective self-defence to that group. In basic terms, there are no passengers in a task group, and each ship complements each other to give effect to the task group mission. You've heard it before, the sum is greater than the parts. It's not about the platform, it's about the system it works within. Contemporary modelling reflects effects-based planning methodologies and has been considered already in the C5000 work, but it does require constant iteration as technologies change and alternative paths are explored. Future force design seeks the liberal use of innovation and promotes vertical and horizontal integration across the services and with our allies and our partners. And again, Lieutenant General Caligari will touch on this during his presentation. Now, the third issue I want to talk about is ship availability. Some of you will know me. This is not a gripe about contemporary maintenance practice. In my view, ship availability is as much a capability as a smart weapons system. It is an inherent part of effects-based planning and should be one of those factors considered before the number of platforms is settled. I raised this recently at the Submarine Institute of Australia conference last year in Fremantle. There I spoke about the effect of deterrence and the role of our submarine force in it. I opined that deterrence is a concept which is created and not a physical object that is bought. The operational effectiveness of a force is as much about platform availability as it is about the weapons system. I contend that a large part of availability stems from the proper management of sustainment, and I strongly believe that sustainment methodology for a ship, throughout its life and to the point of disposal, should be derived during the concept design of the platform. My interest in this is twofold. Firstly, as the immediate past commander of the Australian fleet, I saw firsthand each day the successes and sometimes the failures of maintenance practice across a variety of platforms and the effect that this had on ship availability. It dictated the operational outcomes each day. It caused me to think about asset management as much about the certification of warfighting skills. Secondly, now as the service chief, I have a role to ensure that Navy has raised, trained and sustained the fleet to allow the Commander of Joint Operations Command to successfully employ forces on operations. And again, using a USN parlance, so I'm also the sustainment guy. I am responsible for all elements that deliver that force. If ships are not available to train crews, then I fail. Equally, if sustainment of an ageing ship demands the lion's share of my available resources, be they financial, infrastructure or workforce, then other parts of the system will suffer. In simple terms, I am wholly accountable for the second and third order effects of the non-availability of platforms, and thus clearly I have an interest in how these aspects are considered in the force design stage. There are some useful examples of asset management from other industries, and I believe these would be valuable models for the shipbuilding industry. And I offer one example now quickly, but I ask you, this is not a solution, and I ask you to put it in context. It's just a different way of thinking through a problem. And some of you have heard me say this before. Just consider an airline where in one centre, say in Sydney, but it could be in any marginal electorate, we find that it is monitoring all the international flights in real time. There's a small team of technicians that are doing that, and operational experts. The centre houses both simulators, logistic management centres, and a publications office. When the temperature rises on one of the engines on one of their London-bound A380s, the team instantly analyses the issue. They check it against all other engines in their fleet at that time. It contacts the engine manufacturer to see if there are any technical bulletins they may have missed or that are relevant to this particular scenario. They test the conditions in the maintenance simulator just next door. They solve the problem. They change technical procedures by e-copy. They prepare parts to be available on arrival in London, and then they alert the crew. This is true asset management. Now, I know some will apply that and say it doesn't work in all areas of conflict, but there are lessons to be learned here. There are different ways that we should be thinking to do this. In this scenario, all this is done to maximise aircraft availability and therefore profit. And in this case, profit is measured in revenue per air mile for the company. In Navy's case, profit would be deterrence. But in managing this scenario for a fleet of surface combatants, the benefits would also accrue in the second and third order effects, where reduced workforce demands, less technical staff, more stability in their postings to those one centres, and better alignment with infrastructure needs would result. Again, reduced training infrastructure, common use facilities, etc. For Navy, we must appreciate that our ability to upgrade systems over time is just as important in contributing to the effect when selecting the system than just the system's performance on delivery. Indeed, the basis for future force being fit for purpose, credible and affordable is our ability to evolve our systems rather than simply replace them. I have laboured this example only to reiterate my point that Navy requirements must go beyond the traditional platform capability considerations and should include fleet-wide sustainment system requirements as a matter of course. Equally, the maritime industry should be alive to this and invest more in these methodologies. These measures would likely place industry closer to Navy in a management arrangement that matches operational needs with performance outcomes for industry. Believe me, my experience as a fleet commander, I would say this is not such a bad thing. Lastly, I need to talk briefly about affordability. In the future, we can expect the Navy's major surface combatants to be capable of coherent, independent operations, while also being capable of contributing individual ships or task groups to coalition operations at both the regional or global level. But the fleet needs to be affordable and within our reach. In reconciling this conundrum, again I would paraphrase Admiral Rowden, who, in speaking of the USN, said, "The current fiscal environment certainly impacts on the design and delivery of the future fleet. But we minimise those impacts by favouring capability over capacity. To my mind, innovation, culture and people resonate as being an integral part of this capability decision." He's absolutely right. In essence, the pressure is on me to make sure that our requirements planning processes are both disciplined and strategic. How we deliver the strategic goals must be determined by what these goals are, and not the other way around. Now, I started this presentation indicating that we had a confluence of timing around major shipbuilding programs and highlighted the aggregated cost, and this will not be news to anyone. What I've attempted to do in this presentation is to show how Navy requirements will be considered in light of this bow wave of activity and spend. We will need to focus on lethality as a core requirement of any future force. But within financial constraints, I look to reconcile the requirements through an effect-based planning rather than slavish adherence to platform replacement models. Lastly, I would like to see Navy, Defence and industry move to a better asset management model to maximise availability. Navy needs a strong and viable shipbuilding industry. In some ways, the 3 points I've made, I think, will characterise the relationship between Navy and industry as we produce this. With proper consideration of these issues, I see a balanced and effective future surface combatant force. Thank you.